Hey everyone, and welcome to another episode of Broken by Concept, episode 110, a big one. Already, you're probably thinking, who the hell have we got here as a guest on the show? Today we've got with us Phroxzon, lead designer of the game balance team Summoner's Rift. Now, on the Broken by Concept, we are known to be sponsored by Riot. We love Riot Games. We are big fans of Riot. We love the game.
People get confused because we love the game so much. People get like scared about it. And everybody's like, wait, what's going on?
Oh yeah, they think that we're run by we're like a part of we're trying to infiltrate the community and we're like part of Riot. We're actually working for Riot secretly. And I think a big theme of this episode today is going to be we're going to kind of be where we view ourselves as the mediators between kind of the broader community within League of Legends, and then there is Riot Games. And we view Broken by Concept as we're kind of like the middle ground. We're trying to help out, I guess, create a channel of communication between the two. And I think this is a really great opportunity to get Riot or someone who works at Riot side on things, and the goal being, I guess, to provide a little bit more clarity around your intentions surrounding game balance. And I think it'd be a really great opportunity to kind of clear the air in a way. So I'm going to handball it to Nathan. I've heard that you guys might have a little bit of history, so Nathan, take it away.
Yeah, so Phroxzon here is from OS. So this is, I mean, OS, we're just known for generating the best talent, you know. We got us, we got lots of LCS players nowadays. So Phroxzon, you actually run a YouTube channel. It's actually, a lot of people would actually know it. It has like 80,000
people on my Midland Academy have referred to your videos multiple times. Your new ones. I said they're great. They're really, really great videos.
And the channel was originally UNSW LOL. So you used to be part of run the university.
I started that way back when with two other people. So that was in like 2012 when I was at uni. Yeah, that was in my
And I bring this up because this was 2013. That was when I started to get really into the game and when I initially did my climb to Challenger that I've talked about before on the podcast. And I literally remember someone linked me one of your videos. And it was like you had this format, which is just crazy to think that this is what you were doing back then, because educational league space was just not. You had like a, you just like a university lecture. You had like a, the projector, and then you had, the students there sitting there. And what you did is you actually had one of my games. This is when I went by the alias of Rippy. With Rioter and stuff like that, and you were analyzing this game, and someone linked this to me. I was like, "Whoa, what the hell?" Because I was a nobody in the scene at the time, and then I was like, "This guy's like breaking down like my gameplay in high elo oceanic solo queue." And I thought that was literally one of the coolest moments. Like I was like, "Wait, have I made it? Like, what's this?"
That's hilarious. That's funny.
So that's actually my first.
We didn't have replays in the client, right? So we had to use LoL replay. Do you remember that LoL replay?
It was LoL replay or Baron replay. Wasn't there another one called Baron replay as well?
Yeah, there were a few.
For me, it was Baron replay was the first one that I remember.
Yeah. But I was friends with Papa Smithy and Pastry Time back then, and they used to cast off the LoL replay. And it was so buggy. Like the game would just randomly fast forward like 5 minutes.
And no one reviewed that.
Yeah, game. I was gonna say
no one reviewed.
What games. You were doing was dark technology. That was I've never seen that before.
Think about it. We thought we were kind of like the ones that started doing like the lecture slides and stuff. But in a way, Phroxzon was the true innovator of the style of teaching. It was amazing.
It was funny because actually, so back then, I knew Rioter from chess. We used to play chess together.
Wow.
Both him and I were like pretty decent chess players. We used to play in the junior league together. So we went to our first LAN. I think it was like at In Time or something, right? And our team was like kind of bad. And he was like, at the time, he was like, he was so excited because he's like, oh, I didn't know like you played. Because we hadn't seen each other in years. So like in the first time we played a LAN, I went. And then he was like, oh, I just got signed to Frenetic Array, which if you remember, like way back then, they were the top team, right?
Yeah, that was before they became
and
Immunity.
I think we need to give a little bit of context here to our audience. Rioter was a player who's probably one of them. He's an OG high elo player. He was the rank 1 player and probably one of the most dominant Australian players of all time. But he ended up retiring years ago. And you said you played chess with him. So just give a little bit of context.
Yeah.
To people.
Yeah, so we played this LAN, and then he kind of like just 1v9'd the whole thing. And I remember our mid laner, like we prepped AP Tristana mid against Akali because we needed that. It was Chenny Boy. Do you remember Chenny Boy?
Chenny Boy, yeah. Chenny Boy, yeah.
Chenny Boy was a mid laner, so we prepped AP Akali mid against him. And then back then I was a jungler, but then we played AP Tristana, and we like completely destroyed him.
Was that Deathfire Grasp? Was that
Deathfire Grasp, wasn't it?
Yeah. It was like double Doran's, like Deathfire Grasp or something. Like it was crazy, man. League back then was just insane. But yeah, so I started the lecture stuff because we needed a way because we were charging people $5 to join the society, right? And we were like, oh man, how can we like give value back to the people that joined the society? And I was like, well, I'm not like that great. I'm like decent, but I feel like I have a good like understanding of how to teach people how to play. So then, that's where it all came from, basically. Yeah.
And what were you studying at the time at UNSW?
I was doing renewable energy engineering.
Right. And so was doing this league content, was that your in to Riot Games? Like how did you get that? So how did that all work? How did that whole transition work?
So the VP of game design, actually, he was like, oh, I've been watching your content and I really like your approach to your analytical approach to the game and analysis. And he was like, oh, do you want to like try for an internship? And then so I basically did that. And that was in 2014. Yeah, 2014 December. And I was the only intern because I was the only one from the Southern Hemisphere.
Oh my goodness.
In December. So it's crazy, yeah.
This goes to show that back then, that's how innovative it was. It caught the attention of people at Riot because no one made content like that, but now there's heaps of content like that. It's amazing.
I'd say the educational space has only really developed in the last 3-4 years. You know?
Yeah. So out of interest, how much of the Broken by Concept podcast have you listened to? How many episodes have you watched of ours?
Probably like 5 to 10 episodes.
Okay.
Yeah, during quarantine, I would just put it on while I was like cooking or something.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, because I liked the some of the content that you guys put out, just in general, like some of the mid lane stuff. Because I was like trying to recommend some things for mid game because I just never got around to making mid game stuff. So you know, people on my team or like surrounding teams were like, oh, I want to learn about mid game, and I was like, oh, Curtis has some like good stuff, so I would link it in at the podcast, and then I was listening to it. So yeah.
Awesome. So there's a lot of questions that we can dive into here. I'm going to kind of break the ice.
Okay. So again, going back to the context of the podcast. So we're probably going to there's probably going to be a lot of new viewers in this podcast. Obviously Phroxzons watched us, so he knows really what our intention is. Yeah. I was thinking about this the other day. Obviously we're going to be talking about balance and, talking about maybe the process of patch notes, all that sort of stuff. I was literally thinking we've done 110 episodes. This is a solo queue improvement podcast episode. I could probably count on my hand how many times we've talked about the state of the game.
Yeah, we don't really talk about the state of the game all that often.
And I think that should just show the audience, just in terms of, again, this is a solo queue improvement podcast, just letting this, lay it out. We've only talked about the state of the game, maybe big changes like the preseason changes.
That's the only time, really, isn't it?
Like, honestly, like 5 times.
Probably 5 times, yeah.
So that's really interesting. So the other thing as well, just in terms of, maybe people be watching this and be like, guys, like, why didn't you like probe Riot like enough? Like, you got to get into the hard hitting questions. Like, this is from my perspective. Okay. So, I played like lots of other games, like, World of Warcraft. Like, I've played with games in terms of just the speed of changes and balance. Like, I am very grateful for what Riot does. I sort of have faith in Riot, and my mindset is it's out of my control. I don't work for the balance team, I just get the notes. Like, we don't really talk about it. I just have faith. It's like Riot probably knows what they're doing, because compared to every other company, as much as people give Riot shit, like, I've played a lot of games, guys. The changes come months and months, and so every 2 weeks it's actually incredible.
And they care the most about the game and the solo queue experience more than any other game we've ever played. And we got to give props to Riot as well, because I think the game is in one of the most balanced states it's ever been in history. The game has actually been more balanced in the past year than it's ever been. If you actually think back all the way from season 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, it's actually gotten more balanced. I think this last year and a half has been really, really, especially this last year, this season, incredibly balanced. And I think Riot's done an exceptional job. And just to mention, the game has gotten a whole lot complex with a lot more champions. Think about that. Most of the time, the game actually gets more chaotic, more complex because of the champions and items, and it becomes more sophisticated. So we got to start. I mean, I just want to say that straight up. This is not your take, but just for me, I just think the game is incredibly balanced, and they've done a really, really good job.
Oh,
so props to you, Phroxzon.
Thank you.
Yep. Yeah, that's the right apologist there.
It's Riot Coach Curtis and Riot Nathan Mott. Yeah.
Well, okay, I've got something that I really want to get in my mind right now, which is, so how many people are actually involved in the patch process? So we're talking like, is it like, what does the team look like? Is it a global team? Walk us through at a very high level. How many people are involved, man? What's this look like from the start?
Yeah. How about you guess first, and then.
Good question.
I literally just have this visualization of like, you rock up on a Monday morning and it's like maybe like 10, 15 people in the room.
Like a boardroom. And
then maybe, you talk about maybe one person's job was to like talk with the stats, the data from China and Korea, all that sort of stuff. And like you guys come and maybe you have like some Zoom of call of like some other people. That's my visualization.
It'd be like, I reckon 15 to 20 people, something like that.
Yeah.
Yeah, 15 to 20 people is about right. Sometimes like 10 to 15, maybe. Back in the day, it used to be a little less, I would say. Just because like the more people you have, like the harder it is to like get through the meeting sometimes. We're very like data oriented, as you can imagine. I'm probably like one of the biggest advocates for using data because anecdotal is just like, it's so hard to use and it's so prone to bias and all of these things. But we look at, a bunch of different things. So we'll look at one core thing is that we balance for multiple audiences. I don't know if you guys are aware of that, but we balance for 4 audiences. So we balance for average play, which is like 0 to the 90th percentile, which is roughly gold 1 platform. We balance for the skilled bracket, which is 90th to the 99.5 percentile. So that's gold 1 to around diamond 1. And then we balance for elite, which is considered diamond 1 plus, and then we balance for pro. So what we'll do is we'll look at, all of those different skill brackets and look at what is strong and weak in each of those skill brackets. And then we'll make changes that kind of address those things. So definitionally, if something is not considered strong, not considered balanced in any skill bracket, then we have to buff them. And if something is considered overpowered in any skill bracket, then we have to nerf them. And the definitions for underpowered and overpowered vary by skill bracket. Yeah.
And what are some of the metrics that you guys look at?
So strictly, we look at things like win rate. Typically, we look at ban rate. We also have very sophisticated champion mastery data. So I know you guys are fans of champion mastery, but obviously, like some champions are like they're a lot more powerful when they're mastered compared to other champions, right? And so we don't have like a specific external way of like discussing that, like in our framework, but it's something that we like kind of inherently consider. So, for example, let's say Ezreal is at a 49. Let's say Ezreal's 51% win rate. That's like probably a broken champion, almost certainly, even though he's technically balanced within the win rate framework because he's going to break something else, typically pro play. So
yeah, that's actually funny you bring up Ezreal. That's the one champion that I was actually going to talk to you about, because Ezreal, I remember when we had a conversation and you spoke to me about win rate, and I remember I said Ezreal's win rate is not indicative of how good that champion is, but I don't think I had the knowledge to really understand that. But I knew intuitively that Ezreal cannot be weak, even though I think at the time I looked, he had like a 48% win rate or something like that.
Right.
Ezreal was really strong in my games, and it was consistently strong because, but that makes sense because of that skill bracket though, right? Because when you're at an elite level, people who have champ mastery with Ezreal and they know how to hit their skill shots, that champion becomes immediately much better. That's so interesting.
And there's another thing as well, which is like at elite, so diamond 1 plus, the sample size of games is so low that it's hard to make win rate calls on like how strong they are, because Rengar could fluctuate from 52% to like 57% on the next patch, just randomly due to how many one tricks are playing him on that patch or not, right? Maybe some content came out that made a whole flood of like Rengar players want to play him, and they just tank the win rate, right? So for Elite specifically, we have a patch lag system where it's like they have to be at a certain win rate for multiple patches. And we know
that
which
makes so much sense.
Yeah,
that makes sense with Ari, because Ari was out of control for such a long time, and there was actually a meme in my mid lane academy where I said, "Oh, don't worry, Ari will get nerfed. Ari will get nerfed," and it just never got nerfed to the point where like everyone just plays it now, because it's like it almost felt like it was going to go away, but it didn't. But that's intentional. You probably recognize that Ari was strong, but because it's at an elite level, you probably didn't want to make those changes straight away.
Yeah, and then the other thing is that pro players take a really long time and almost frustratingly long time to figure out what's powerful. So let's say, for example, a champion like Sylas, right? Sylas, or like when we did Akali changes, like maybe a few seasons ago, we'll make a change, and it won't be for like 5, 6, 7 patches later when until pros like actually figure out that it's strong. So there's like a significant amount of like pro play lag before they actually like are demonstratively powerful in the pro game. So that makes it also more difficult. So it's just kind of things where it's like we have, for every champion, we basically have an understanding of where they are balanced for a combination of pick rate, win rate, ban rate, and a bunch of other things for every skill bracket. So that's kind of, it's a kind of a crazy operation if you think about it.
Going back into the operation, I want to go back into the room because I'm just obsessed with the visualization of the room. So your role is lead designer.
Mm-hmm.
Do you want to just go over your role
and how that is relevant? Does game balance as one of our primary outputs. So like on a Monday, every second Monday, we'll all get in a room. We have this concept called role owners. So it's too difficult for one person to kind of like understand the balance of the entire game at once. And honestly, it's a bit too much to ask for everyone to be, any given person to be a specialist in all 5 roles. So we split the roles into having role owners. So there'll be a top lane owner and a jungle owner, etc. Those are usually pretty decent players. I mean, everyone who touches balance has at least been like multi-season diamond. Some of them have been masters, and like some have been like top 50 challenger. It really just depends. But yeah, they usually at least have played at a diamond level for multiple seasons, and then they will present basically what needs to be nerfed based on the criteria that we have. So we have a set of criteria. So we'll populate this spreadsheet, pre-populate this spreadsheet with everything that must be nerfed and must be buffed. And then we have a bunch of things that they'll suggest that should be buffed or should be nerfed. And then we'll discuss that list. The should or could. We'll discuss those as a group. So we'll kind of just go down and discuss all the champs and items and runes.
And is this obviously this is in Riot headquarters in Los Angeles.
Mm-hmm.
Is there communication between people who keep tabs on other servers? Because obviously it's the meta within different servers is going to be very different.
You also talk about sample size as well of games, especially in Halo. I mean, you think China, it's massive, right? Would you be using China for a lot of data?
We tend to do an aggregation. We don't strictly balance around China, but we do take notes of any particular trends. China has some like really weird trends. We still haven't figured out, how we're meant to be balancing around China, to be completely frank. It presents a very difficult challenge because China has like, a certain size population, and, we would have to do some like population adjustments that, make the balancing make sense. Because like you said, the regional trends are kind of worth tracking. So like an interesting thing is like, let's say Yuumi, right? Yuumi in NA or EU or probably OS as well is like significantly more frustrating than in Korea, for example. Like Yuumi's ban rate in Korea is like very low compared to the West. or Yasuo in China or something like that. So there's also regional trends, but we don't tend to balance by region generally. We just look at it in aggregate for the most part.
Now, how does balancing interact between champions and items? Because that's a very complex interaction. So walk us through, how does the discussion flow? What are some questions that you guys ask each other? And how does the conversation even begin when it comes to itemization versus champions? And is there an overarching philosophy you guys have when balancing for champs versus items?
Yeah, so we have an intuitive understanding for how much, are you guys familiar with the term power budget?
No.
So let's say a given champion's power, so let's say Ari, right? Ari's total power is a combination of her runes, her the mastery distribution on the champion, the champion's power itself, and the items, right? So there's like roughly four categories. So we'll make an assessment based on is Everfrost too much of Ari's power budget? Let's say, for example, right? And we would be like, oh, we have an intuitive understanding for how much power a certain item should be contributing to a certain champion. So you might think like Malzahar with Liandry's, Ari with Everfrost, like pretty core ones. And then, there are some champions that just have really anti-synergistic items where the item would make up a lot less of their power budget because they just don't have items that are hyper synergistic with them. So what we'll do is we'll say, okay, firstly, like there's item win rates, right? So item win rates, for example, can be propped up or like tanked by the champion's win rate. So in that sense, the champion inherits the item's win rate. So it's not accurate to say, oh, Liandry's is like a 53% win rate because it might just be bought by all high win rate champions, as an example, right? So what we'll try and do is we'll try and isolate how much power the item is giving and how much power the champion is giving. And so in the case that the champion is contributing more of the power than we would intend, and this is a very subjective thing, then we would nerf the champion. And if the item is contributing more, we would be like, oh, okay, well, we should probably nerf the item. And if it pushes another champion to be underpowered as a result, so let's say a fringe user, right? Like let's say, for sake of argument, let's say Victor could only use Liandry's, right? And let's say that we had to nerf Liandry's because we thought that Liandry's was contributing too much power budget to a certain subset of champions, let's say like old dot champions, like Malzahar's, Cassio's, etc. Then we would just have to buff Victor and nerf Liandry's at the same time.
Right. So it's just a constant balance. It's a constant interplay. Yeah.
Yeah.
And there's an element of intuition here, isn't there? Right. It's you can't really, the math and stats can only take you so far. There's an element of an intuition and subjective view on a lot of this. Hence why these players or the people that are on your team also have to have a really good finger on the pulse, and they're hired for that reason.
Definitely. One thing I will say is that we use this concept of, or at least I use this concept of fringe users to determine when an item is contributing too much or too little power budget. So let's say, for example, who would you guess would be a fringe user of Liandry's? Like, who do you think could flexibly use Liandry's relative to another item, for example?
Like what? Like equally?
Yeah. Like who would you use
Victor.
Exactly. So for me, I use like Victor, Oriana to determine like, okay, well, if Oriana and Victor are like dominatingly purchasing Liandry, something's probably wrong, right?
Right. That makes sense.
Whereas if someone like Malzahar is dominatingly purchasing Liandry's, something could be wrong, but it's not necessarily wrong. Yeah, it makes more sense. It's a natural to their pattern. So one thing that we've made mistakes on in the past is be like, Lichbane has a really high win rate, and it's like, oh, we should nerf Lichbane. But that's not necessarily the case because the only champions that purchase Lichbane, they don't really have an alternative, right? Like if you look at, there's definitely, so I like to use the mental model of fringe users to kind of determine whether an item is contributing too much or too little power budget.
Yeah, it's a cool like little hack in a way to determine it. Yeah.
It sounds like you guys talk about champ identity then, right? That's what you'd have to be talking about, because it's like Malzahar's like a percentage health damage type, so Liandry sort of makes sense.
Yep.
Do you guys like have like a list of like, or is it just all assumed knowledge?
Do you have categories in a way? Like, do you have kind of categories for how you categorize these particular champions?
Yeah, there's a disgusting amount of tribal knowledge, I would say. And it kind of helps because think of it this way. A lot of the champion designers like still work at Riot and have kind of like talked about how they want their champion to be designed around. So if, for example, I was like, hey, August, like, do you like that Gnar is building Stridebreaker or something, right? He'd be like, or like, I might be like, oh, do you like that Gnar is building Divine Sunderer, right? He could be like, oh yeah, I would prefer that Gnar builds Divine Sunderer versus Stridebreaker or something, like just for sake of argument, because August made Gnar. Then he would be like, oh, okay, well, maybe we should change around like Gnar's ratios to like bias him towards a certain type of item or something like that. So it's like we can get the perspective of the person who designed the champion and understand whether they want the power to be in that. So yeah, it's a very interesting dynamic. Yeah, and you basically multiply that by like 150. And in case that the design is not there, then someone who's like responsible for or like is passionate about how they feel like the champion should be played optimally for fun. Like what is the best version of the champion, then they will present that vision, and then we can like balance around that. So it'd be like, yeah.
I want to segue this one kind of into like how much of a plan, do you guys have like kind of a yearly roadmap to how you want the game to feel and look like throughout the year? For example, I have this theory that like, obviously Riot they prop up damage at the beginning of the year. This is like my theory. They prop up damage and because it's easier to lower damage than it is to increase damage. It's less risky, to decrease damage throughout the year than increase damage later in the year. So it's easier to nerf it. So in a way, at the preseason, they buff damage, they make damage, they just put a lot of damage into the game. And then incrementally towards Worlds, it becomes more like this. Like it gets less and less, more tanks come back into the meta. And like the game always looks very similar by the time Worlds runs around. Is this just like a coincidence or how much of a plan do you guys have throughout the year, and how far in advance do you guys try to plan for?
I wouldn't say it's like an intentional thing, but think of it this way. When you're adding something new to the game, it's much easier to add something in it's much easier to like make something more attractive by giving it damage, right? Like let's say, for example, you're making a new item, right? It's much less attractive to like release an item that just like doesn't do that much, or like is not.
Because you want people to build it.
Yeah, you want people to build it. You want that exposure, and then if it's too strong, then we can nerf it later, right? Whereas if you release an item that's like underpowered, no one builds it, and it never sees the light of day.
Right. So you don't get the sample size.
Yeah, you don't get the sample size. People don't even like consider it in the what do you call it? Like in their mental space, right? So it's like I think Crown of the Shattered Queen kind of suffered from this, which was an item
That's
I made.
The perfect example. That was every item was everyone built at the beginning of the
Crown
season.
is really good right now, though. I think Crown is really. I think it's really underrated. Not many people build it.
Exactly.
And
because we nerfed it into oblivion, right? And then everyone forgot about it.
Yeah, everyone's forgotten about it. And right now, there's actually a build that one of the Victor players in my mid-lane academy innovated that no one else in the world builds. Crown into Lichbane on Victor. And it's like a fringe build. And I literally get flamed for building it, but it's like the ultimate build path because it has the perfect balance of utility, defensive stats. It's cheap, and the second item spike with Lichbane because it's relatively cheap and pure damage. It's like the perfect combo, but no one knows about it purely because this phenomenon, Crown, was considered a bad item for so long.
Yeah. So imagine if everything releases like weak, right? Then people don't really get to see or experience the content. It's always like easy. It's easier to like rein it back from being like in the spotlight than it is to promote something, because you need to make it like even more overpowered than it should have been to get adopted. That's not to say that we intentionally make them too strong, but if we had to choose like slightly on the stronger side of balance versus slightly on the weaker side of balance, we'd probably choose slightly on the stronger side.
And I'm assuming that applies the same for champions as well, right? When they're added into the game, they obviously want to be stronger than weak because you want people to play them and feel them out and understand their kits, right?
Yeah, champions is a bit of a different case though, because champions always bring hype with them. And so it's like people are going to try them anyway. And so usually like we don't want to break the game immediately by releasing something like really OP. We try and aim for, at least for champions, like on launch, they like are roughly balanced for at least one audience that we have high confidence for. It's really difficult to land a champions balance for all 4 audiences on release. Yeah. It's kind of impossible to like try and do that.
So tying back to the roadmap question, is there a roadmap for how far in advance do you guys plan your patches out?
Oh, so we definitely like plan for, whether or not we want to do something in mid-season. And we always want to have a preseason, and we have a pretty good idea, at least by March, like what the preseason is going to look like. We don't really like plan intentionally, like the way that you said, like, oh, we're just going to creep the damage down slowly. But we definitely optimize around like certain high profile tournaments to make sure the viewer experience is not like just like super sleeper, right? Sleeper. Like Corky is here or something, right? Like, yeah. But we also know that there's value in seeing those champions be viable at some time during the year. So we, because like as few Corky and Azir players there are, it's exciting to see your favorite champion pro play, right?
Of course.
Or your favorite streamer playing the champion that you love, right? So
yeah. I'm gonna keep reeling off questions, Nathan. So if you want to jump in, you're all good, or do you want me to keep going? I got some more questions.
Keep going, Curtis.
Okay. So this might be more of I don't want you. This is not like when I ask this question, I want you to answer it not as if you're a writer, but you as like an independent player of the game.
Yeah. Okay.
Are there kind of champions in the game that you kind of wish maybe they were outdated, maybe not, but just champions you wish maybe 3 champs, if you could remove maybe 3 champs from the game, that would make your life much easier, or you would prefer they weren't in the game? What would they be if you had a choice?
That would make my life easier.
Yeah. So like, obviously this is not representing Riot's opinion or anything, but just you personally, like what would 3 champs that if you get like would just make your life easier in terms of either balancing the game or make the game feel better? Are the champs in the game that feel like to you don't really have a place, or just are outdated, or just kind of ruin the balancing of the game?
It's a hard question to answer because there's 3 things, like you said. One is like, okay, the champion's outdated. Doesn't mean we should remove them. Probably means we should rework them because there's probably still an audience that likes that player. There are definitely champions that have given us a lot more grief in terms of balancing than others. I would say one is Zeri recently. One is Akali. Mainly because it's hard to understand what their strength and weakness profile should look like for all 4 audiences at once. So champions that understand very well, or understand how to manipulate the things that they have on their kit, those present some pretty unique challenges for us. So for example, Akali is like, okay, well, assassins are generally meant to be like not so great at team fighting. But Akali has a tool that like allows her to survive in a team fight for a long time. And assassins are meant to be like, some of them are meant to be like pretty good at side laning, but then Akali's very safe, right? Or like assassins are meant to be like kind of abusable in lane early, but Akali just had a lot of high base health and like a lot of health regen, right? So Akali definitely presented a lot of challenges for us because all of the things that we would typically do to move them out of pro play would just crater them in certain audience buckets, right? It would make them like really unusable in average play, for example, if we just directly tried to attack the things that pro players were complaining about. Because like, as an example, right, like Akali going Doran's shield with resolve, second wind or whatever.
Yeah, it's already giving me PTSD right now.
Yeah, it's like why not nerf the regen? And it's like, okay, well, I mean, obviously we could nerf the regen, but we care about 4 audiences. We don't care about only 1 audience. So like, it would be a very simple problem if I was just like, okay, well, I only care about pro play, right? Then it's like, yeah, well, obviously we'll just nerf the regen. But it's like, it's simple as that. We need to care about, the Akali players that have invested time and sometimes even invested money into playing this champion, we can't just like make the champion unplayable for them, right? So Akali, Zeri, and I want to say Master Yi. Master Yi is like, he's so hard to balance, I think, because he kind of only does one thing, which is like chop you up with auto attacks.
It's like Garen as well, isn't it?
Yeah, but Master Yi has a lot more innate target access than Garen, which makes him like kind of innately more frustrating. You can at least point at something that you can do against Garen every game, right? Which is like, okay, we'll kite out Garen or like run away from him. But you can't really say, okay, the counter to Master Yi is CC him, right? But some champions just don't have CC. So it's like, okay, well, if I don't have CC, like what am I meant to do against Master Yi kind of deal? Like it's very disempowering in that sense. So I think that's why one of the reasons why his ban rate is so high, and the perception that he doesn't take any skill because he just right clicks you, even though like dodging stuff with Alpha Strike or like frame perfect meditating or meditating auto cancel is like somewhat skillful. Players don't like intuit that. They just see him chopping you and then they're just like, this champion's ridiculous.
I've got there's one champ that is commonly, especially with the lower elo clients that I coach, have a problem with, is Vlad.
Oh yeah,
Vlad for me, and I don't know if I'm biased, but because I don't like the champ, but I feel like that champion is simply the definition of outdated. Like that champ, in my mind, it couldn't ever be released now, not even close. And I feel like every single time a low elo player tries to approach dealing with Vlad, it's not intuitive. Like the way to counter Vlad is not intuitive to them. And then and it almost feels like it makes the user, like the low elo experience for Versa, like I'm talking golds and stuff and below, it's not obvious how to counter that champion. Is Vlad one of those champs that for you is kind of on the radar of outdated, or is that one of those champs that's looking like, maybe you can't give this away, but is that a champ that you feel like, do you feel as though it's a problem champion, or that's just or not, or is this just
I don't find Vlad a problem champion, but can you define outdated for me?
Well, the concept, and our title of our podcast called Broken by Concept, the concept of not having mana and your damage healing you by concept is kind of broken in my mind. And it's very difficult in my mind to balance it because you think, oh yeah, Vlad's like kind of low range and then I can kind of like poke him out or something, but then he sustains. And in lower elo brackets, wave management isn't really a thing. So then the counter to Vlad is obviously he has low wave clear, so you can stack waves. And so that's usually the counter to Vlad. But for a lot of people, that's not really intuitive. And especially in like bronze and silver, they just think, oh, but he's unkillable. He's just going to completely out sustain, and he scales. So they get like, there's like that. It's that combination of multiple factors. Is this just a thing that, I feel like it's like that same problem where it's the four audiences. For the high elo people, they don't really worry too much about that. It's basically useless. Yeah. In the lower elo, there's like a huge gap, it feels like, between the two or the multiple audiences. How do you okay, a better question to ask is, how do you deal with that when there is one audience that has like a really hard time with the champ and another audience that it's really not a problem at all? How do you guys go about that process?
So we'll do something like, we'll very frequently like take stock of the roster and look for champions that need work. These champions need work for a multitude of reasons. One being, they're either pro skewed, which is to say that they are very strong in pro and like kind of useless in average play, or vice versa, like the thing you're saying with Vlad, though I don't think Vlad is actually that good in low elo because he's got like a very significant mastery curve. Yeah, okay. He's actually very hard to play for most people. I think he's got a very mastery curve. And other ones could be like the champion is lacking fantasy, or like like Tarek or something, right? It's like, he's meant to be an anti-armor guy, but he doesn't really like portray that in in gameplay very well. So there are these types of champions, and we'll just prioritize them. So like, let's say, for example, if we were talking about Vlad and we were like, let's just like assume a premise and say Vlad was like a low elo stomper, we would make some changes to Vlad. We would think, okay, well, what are things that are better optimized by high elo players and worse optimized by low elo players? So we did something similar for Master Yi recently, we were like, okay, well, low elo players just right click you with Master Yi for the most part. They're not really like hyper optimizing Alpha Strike to dodge missiles or using meditate auto cancels or that kind of thing. So let's put some more power budget in Master Yi's like optimizations and take some power budget out of his like auto attacking. And that shored up some of Master Yi's difference in his skill brackets. And we've done things similar for like Garen. Like for example, when he presses W, he gets like tenacity and that kind of thing. Yeah, we'll basically like take the champion and
it's make it more. It's giving it a higher skill cap in a way.
Yeah. And we'll do that on a case-by-case basis, right? Like some champions are just meant to be easy to play, right?
Right. Okay.
And some champions are not. And so, it's a matter of degrees. Like obviously in a perfect world, every champion would be playable for every audience, but it's just kind of like unrealistic. So we kind of just accept the fact that some champions are just not going to be particularly strong in a certain bracket. Yeah.
What are some things that you wished maybe the community understood or knew more about the balancing process? Because we hear a lot of complaints on. I'm assuming I can imagine the boardroom and it gets brought up. This is the community's response to X, Y, Z. What are some things that you wish, like maybe common knowledge or a bit of insight into the balancing process?
Yeah. Okay. So one thing is that I think the community has no idea at all how difficult game design is. Game design is so difficult. Like just think about the number of like permutations and combinations of every possible thing, right? We have to think about, not only do we need to think about these things, we need to think about them ahead of time, right? Let's say you're making an item. You have to think about how that item is used on every possible champion rune combination in any team comp, like not to mention, and that's just how it's optimized, right? That's not even to talk about like the design quality of the thing, right? So it's like, is the thing satisfying when you press the button? Is the thing intuitive? Does the thing have counterplay? Is the thing, responsive? Like all of these like esoteric values that the community doesn't consider. It's just like, oh, well, was it overpowered on a release? Man, Riot's an idiot kind of thing, right? So that's one thing I wish the community was more aware of, like just how many different things that game designers are juggling, and that there's like an entire bucket of craft behind game design. The second thing is probably just like it's very difficult to predict balance changes ahead of time. I did a poll on Twitter recently about, can you estimate how much win rate this Gangplank list is going to be in Platinum, right? And I think like there was an equal amount of votes for like every category. Like I put up 4 categories and they were like all equal. So it's like
that's really helpful. Wow.
Yeah, I'm like, thanks, wow, guys. Yeah, like you're really good at like predicting, like what the outcome is going to be. Here. So, we will predict what the outcome is going to be for every skill bracket. And we're like quite accurate, I would say. We're within like 1%, about 70 to 80% of the time.
Wow.
So we have a lot of experience like guessing these things. But yeah, when you need to put your stake in the ground and say, I'm betting my career that this is going to do something, suddenly everyone is quiet. Right? Like it's just like, hey,
it's easy to say something in hindsight, knowing what we know now, right?
Yeah. It's like, hey, person on the street, tell me exactly how much win rate this Master Yi change is going to be, and bet $10,000 on it. It's like, oh, no takers? Like, wow, that's surprising.
That's league community in a nutshell. Yeah. No accountability. No.
It's like, oh man, couldn't you have seen that this Master Yi change was going to be like 6% or something? It's like, yeah. And these things are like really hard to estimate, right? There's so many moving parts. There could be item changes going in the patch. There could be like champion interactions, or like play rate could increase, which will decrease the win rate, that kind of thing. So like, if more players play it, then there's probably more new players playing it, and that like kind of changes the way that the win rates play out, that kind of thing. So there's just a lot of factors involved.
Yeah. You talk Phroxzon a lot. You guys are very data driven.
Yeah.
Do you, like, I mean, you post the notes. You took over Mark Yetta, and then I think it was someone else. I think it was August, and then I mean, I can't even imagine what your Twitter notifications look like. Do you even read them?
Sometimes I just laugh at them most of the time. I'm like kind of like
it's just entertaining.
Yeah,
you probably wake up to 1,000 plus.
I want to just quickly riff on one thing you said, Phroxzon, that I loved was the esoteric things around design of an item or a champion. And I think I love this because I feel like Yone is a perfect example of a kit that feels amazing. Like the feel of the champion, like balance aside and all the other crap around it. Like there are certain, I feel like Riot do a really good job, especially nowadays with the feel of particular kits. Like back in the day, certain kits felt very clunky, but nowadays, like the Yone is the first one that comes to mind. People who talk to me about champs that they love, it's like the feel of the champ. They don't even have a word to describe it. It's like when I play this champion, it just feels right. And the way those abilities work together, and when you press that button, and I think Riot do a really good job of that. And I love that you guys are aware of the feeling of things, not just the data itself. I like that you use that word. So yeah, I'm really happy to hear that.
Crafted experience. It's champion designers put so much care into, put so much care into everything just feels right. And they'll like do all these like tiny micro adjustments, even, like a 0.2 second cast time compared to a 0.25 second cast time, like working with the animator to be like, oh man, this is going for like 1 frame too long. It doesn't like quite flow with the combo. Or like, let's say like another example is like, okay, well, let's look at like Elise's spider Q, for example, right? It's like, what should the cooldown of Elise's spider Q be intuitively to you? Tell me, what do you think should happen? What do you think should be the cooldown of Elise's spider Q if you were to just think of it in abstract?
Nathan, what do you think? The pressure's on.
So is this what I think, or was it what it is?
If you were to describe in feeling, when do you feel like the second Elise Q should come out? Just relative to her other abilities.
Well, I'm just trying to think of the combo, right? So, I mean, I definitely want it to be pretty short. Like, yeah, I mean, I'm pretty happy with it. I played a lot of Elise in the preseason. I'm pretty happy with the way it feels like right now.
So the way I would think about it is, if you wanted Elise's kit to flow, you might be like, okay, well, she has to go from transforming from human to spider.
Yeah, it's about the cooldown of her spider form compared to the human form. Yeah.
So you would like try and do some matching with the cooldowns of the spider form and the human form. And she's got a W duration in spider form, right? So wouldn't it make sense for the second Q to come out when the spider's
duration of the spider's
duration expires?
Yeah, that makes sense.
Wouldn't it then make sense for her to transform back into human after she's done her second Q? Right.
Good job, Riot, designing Elise. It feels pretty good, man.
And so it's kind of just
I actually never thought about this. I just take shit for granted, man. Like,
exactly, and that's
playing League of Legends.
Like,
this champ should feel good. If it doesn't feel good, I'm not playing this champion.
Yeah, and so that's why I talk about like, a crafted experience. Game designers have to think about all of these things for, and when it comes out, it's just incredible. Like, oh, at least this Q cooldown is too long or like too short, or it does it, but it's like every little thing on a champion, especially modern champions, have been planned, down to the T, from the animation to the VFX to the sound cues, to the like cooldowns of the ability, so that the kit all flows together. Yeah, it's kind of crazy.
I want to. You've also mentioned champion mastery quite a bit. We spoke about champion mastery a lot. That's obviously a big mantra here at the Broken by Concept, and I feel like we talk a lot about on this podcast how people shit on champ mastery. Like people really disrespect champ mastery. Like they automatically assume. Like we tell our clients that you got to have a small champ pool. We think that's a fundamental of climbing in the game. You can only play, like I say, in gold. Like you should only be playing 2 champs max.
Well, the idea, the philosophy behind us is that we can only think about so many things at a time. If you get down the muscle memory for the way you play champion, then you're actually playing. Then you're playing League of Legends.
Not really playing
assessing the map state, what's the next objective, think about what's next, think about your teammates' item spikes, all that sort of stuff. So that's our philosophy, why champ mastery is so important. It's purely because of the muscle memory aspect.
And have you guys at Riot, has this been a discussion in Riot where you guys are as a design team or balance team feel frustrated with the lack of respect for champion mastery? Or has that been that's been brought up before?
I actually feel like the community like almost over indexes into champion mastery because of the way that we've constructed the solo queue experience. To climb effectively, you basically need to focus on 2 to 3 champions. Like typically speaking, like most players that play the game focus on 2 to 3 champions when they're playing ranked. This is not like for normals or like flex or whatever, but
send these clients my way.
Yeah, I never get these clients. That's the funny thing. I've never. It's actually the other way around with what we've seen.
So there's definitely like some segmentation, right? It's not like 90% of people like do champion mastery and 90% don't. But we definitely do have those. The ranked experience incentivizes you if you want to climb intelligently to do that, right?
Right.
And the cost of changing the champion that you play is just going to immediately crater your win rate in ranked, right? If I went from playing a mage, because I'm a mage player, right? If I went from playing a mage and then I like suddenly tried to learn, I don't know, Zed or something. Well, Zed is like a little more magey than other assassins. Maybe like Fizz or something, right? Then I would just have to lose 30 games in a row, right, to get to the same level that I played at before.
Way more, actually.
Yeah, so the ladder like inherently like just biases you towards playing a certain champion. So whether or not that's the player's tendency or not, it's definitely what the ladder has like optimized out to being, which we're not like super happy about for a multitude of reasons. But yeah.
So you guys think that you guys want people to be playing lots more different champions?
Yeah, just from the reason why is because one of the things that drives League of Legends longevity is variance and replayability. And there's a few things here. When you are playing a hyper-optimized, Orianna, like let's say I'm playing Orianna and I've like, figured out how I'm going to play like the first few waves. I've figured out like how my jungle's pathing, how enemy jungle's pathing, and I've got that all super optimized. And I play against an autofield player. That player gets like absolutely crated, like completely destroyed, right? And that's not like really a great experience for anybody because I'm like, okay, well, I didn't even get to play the game, and they definitely didn't get to play the game. Whereas if people are playing a wider variety of champions, you're going to be in situations where everyone is happier. So if we're thinking of it in terms of like holistic happiness of League of Legends players, there's only some small subset of them that are playing because they want to like climb. But a lot of people just play League of Legends because it's fun and they want to see a bunch of different things. And I want to play Shyvana because she's a dragon, right? Only very small subset of the ladder is like the heavy ranked grinding people that like you guys, for example, right? Or myself, right? So
yeah, it's actually so we need to realize sometimes we get so caught up and we're so passionate about the solo queue experience. We realize that it's actually a very small subsection of people that we actually cater to.
Bubble.
Yeah, it's a bubble. It's a very minuscule bubble.
Yeah, some people just want to come home and play ranked because they had a bad day at work and like they just want to hop on and play Garen and they don't want to invest like 10,000 hours to like understand the intricacies of Ribbon or whatever, right? Like.
Yeah, I have a meme. I always say like to some of my low gold clients, like the people you're versing, like if you're in gold 4 or silver, these are guys that probably come home from work, crack open a beer, got a leg on one side of the desk, and just smashing away, But it's actually true. A lot of them, there are a lot of people out there that play for fun. Mm-hmm. Switching gears a bit here. Have you guys thought about, is there ever going to be a cap to the amount of champions in the game? Because obviously it's getting so unbelievably complex. Has this been a discussion?
It's definitely been a discussion. I think we've still got a lot of flex to go. Just because so there are a few things that make a lot of champions unsustainable. One is if champions are like unintuitive. So like, let's say I run into Thresh and he throws a hook that looks like a hook, but then it just like goes over somebody, right? You'd be like, what the hell is that? Like, I'm so used to something that looks like a hook that hits me, but now it's like changing direction, and you're like, what? Like, I don't understand like how that works. So if we make unintuitive champions, then yes, the cap is the making more champions is an issue because it massively multiplies the number of things that you need to understand to play the game properly.
You're running out of mechanics. Is that what you're saying?
Right, so you're
But
thinking
if
more
it's
as the
intuitive-
underlying mechanics. As long as the underlying mechanics are intuitive and people can
and
adjust
clear.
to them,
Yeah.
then you can keep adding them in. Otherwise, right? So, interesting.
Anything that's got something that's unique that is specifically difficult to play around. So that's why we try and add things. So every champion that gets released is unique in some aspect. We try to make sure that the thing that is unique is as intuitive as possible, so as to not consume that mindshare budget, right? Because if you're thinking of a player, right, a player needs to consume, let's say, right now we're at like 160, right? So every player needs to consume and understand 160 champions to play the game effectively. That becomes a lot more difficult when every hook champion has its hook like function in a slightly different way, right? Like you're just like, oh crap, like Blitzcrank's Q can do a 90-degree turn. You're like, oh well crap, like like that becomes way more difficult to understand. But if we say most hooks like function the same way, like most mystic shot looking things function the same kind of way.
It's quicker to learn, you're saying, for new players.
It's not that complex, right?
It's
not that complex. Like we can pick up on those because we've already developed the muscle memory. We know how to react to those things.
Correct. It's only when we do something that completely subverts the expectation of what that spell or what that missile or what that VFX means, then we get into problems, right? If it's like, hey, this thing plays a large circle on the ground, but then instead of like doing a bunch of damage, it like, I don't know,
kills your team or something. People are going to avoid it.
Is an example
in a way
an example of this Gwen W?
Yeah, it could be. It could be. I mean, but Gwen W.
That doesn't feel intuitive. Did that feel it for you? Did that guys? That didn't feel intuitive at all.
Something new yet to learn.
Yeah, but even still now, it's
Samira's or the thing that ricochets things off it. That's new as well.
That's kind of new and unique. But like the Gwen W for me personally, I mean, maybe I just hate that champ. I'm just biased, but like it didn't feel intuitive to play around. Like, what do you do? Like, what do you do when Gwen is in your face and that thing is there? It's not obvious or intuitive.
It's like, do you run away or do you go into it?
Do you run in or do you run away? Do you want to run into a Gwen? It didn't feel intuitive to me. That's like the one.
I will say it's an aspirational value, right? It's like we try to hit it when we can. In the case of Gwen W, right? It's like, okay, well, she needed to have this mechanic because we wanted her to be able to function in melee range to hit the front line without getting blasted by ranged champions, right? And so it's like, oh well, this is a mechanic that kind of makes sense. So Gwen was like built around that mechanic. Now that's a very difficult mechanic to visualize, right? Like Xin Zhao kind of does it well because he can put an invulnerable tag on himself, but Gwen's is a little different because she's not technically invulnerable. So it's just like, okay, well, it presents a different visualization challenge. So sometimes the mechanic is just like kind of unique enough that it's like it's too hard to like visualize. Like the champion designer, the animators, and the VFX and sound will try and put their heads together and try and figure out the best way to represent it. But sometimes with like unique mechanics, it's way too hard to get a perfect solve for that, is what we call it, like a perfect solve. Like so that's probably like Gwen's example. So like Gwen is immune is like the meme, but it's like we had to resort to like adding text because the state was like a bit unclear, right?
Right.
It's like we wouldn't want to do that in an ideal world, but sometimes have to.
You obviously were always quite the advocate of solo queue. You played a lot of solo queue and always been at least diamond above. How much solo queue are you currently playing at the moment? What's your rank at the moment?
So I've been stuck at like plat 1 D4 level for like quite a while now.
Do you get to play much?
Not great. So the problem is that I get home and I'm very tired, and so I have like 1 day a week where I get to try hard, essentially, and it's contingent on my sleep. I'm like a very like sleep. I can notice. You guys talk about like expressing your best self, right? It's like I feel like if I get below 8 hours of sleep, I can't play properly. And also there's just some things where it's like I don't play with sound because I get overwhelmed. So I understand everything that happens in the game. Like if I'm reviewing or something, I can review at a pretty high level. But if I'm playing the game, I get overwhelmed by too much stuff. Maybe I'm just like externalizing blame there, because I'm definitely doing a lot of stuff that's like no good. But I attribute a lot of it to like being my mental stack getting overwhelmed, because like I can't track the jungler and the support rooms at the same time. One thing that I think is like you guys kind of take for granted is you guys seem to have like a very large mental stack somehow. I don't know if you trained that or whatever, but like for me, I find it very difficult to think about all the things that you guys are thinking about at once. And I feel like that holds me back in a way.
It's something that takes time to develop. It just takes a lot of games.
Yeah.
It's just a lot of games. Yeah. It's a lot of,
but it's like, I don't feel like my problem is playing games, because I play a lot of games. So it's just like, I don't really know how to train that. But I find like if I'm hyper focusing on laning, right, and I'm just like, I'm playing the lane at like, peak intensity, while having to track the jungler, while having to track support rooms, while thinking about my base timings, while thinking about my win conditions, like it's just like it's too much.
I'll go ways I can help with that. We're going to get some coaching in, Phroxzon. I know how to tackle that one.
This is the client. It's funny because talking about the you get home from work tired. I mean, that's a very common mailbag question we get all the time.
We get that one all the time.
And sometimes there really isn't an answer,
And playing on 80% intensity is better than not playing at all. Or sometimes doing 2 blocks is better than a 3 block or something like that. Yeah.
Yeah. But I played probably, last season I probably played like 700 games, I would say. This season has been a lot more busy because I transitioned into the lead role. I'm thinking about League like 10 hours a day at my job.
So burnt of League,
and
honestly,
then I'm like,
whole life of League.
No, but I'm actually like excited to go home and play. I'm just like, like it. So here's an interesting thing. For devs that work on League, they fall into 2 camps. Either they just work on League for 10 hours a day and then go home and play for 3 or 4 hours a day like me, or they work on League for 10 hours a day and then they're just like cold turkey.
Too much.
And it actually, in some ways, it makes them a better game designer, because they're playing other games and they're learning more concepts from other games, and they're like translating different concepts and how they could be used in League of Legends. For me, I feel like that's a weakness, because I play so much League that it makes me like worse at my job in some ways, because I'm not getting
because you probably create more biases in a way sometimes.
Exactly.
Yeah,
I'm way more biased towards making League-like mechanics than I am than I would be if I was playing like WoW or something, right? Like I've played a lot of games, right? Like I played WoW and StarCraft and Call of Duty and like Apex and all of these things like a lot. But it's just like, yeah, you definitely lose something by playing so much League. But yeah.
All right, guys, I'm ready to take over with some jungle questions.
I know Nathan's got some burning questions. He's been waiting. He's ready.
I'm the jungler. The first question I would ask, because Curtis cut me off abruptly before, but I was going to ask about the about the community perception. Like, let's say, you talked a lot about you guys are very data driven. There's got to be some talk about what community, like, let's say, for example, in the Corki Azir meta and stuff like that, like things that people don't want to like sort of see, like if you were to put percentage, what is it in terms of like data, and then like actually like communities really upset about this, they don't want it in the game anymore?
So one thing to understand is that it's a global game, right? The majority of our players don't speak English. We have to look at, when we're talking about sentiment, we have to look at, Chinese sentiment, Korean sentiment, even Southeast Asian sentiment, as well as the Western region sentiments, right? And the Western region sentiments usually like follow each other, and Brazil as well, right? So what we'll do is when we're looking at sentiment, we just need to be very careful of not being like Reddit biased, which has happened in the past because we can read English, right? And so sentiment does play a factor. It can make us look at things, right? We might be like, oh, not EU, English-speaking regions are complaining about specifically Corki Azir. Okay, is everyone else complaining about this too? That would be the kind of like thought process that we do with perception. Then if global perception is like that, then we'll probably do something. If it's like something very region-specific, like I mentioned before, Western regions really hate Yuumi, but Korea doesn't actually hate Yuumi very much, right? Like the ban rates for Yuumi compared to other champions is like quite a lot lower. And so it's like, oh, well, is it just the West complaining about Yuumi, or is it like everybody complaining about Yuumi? So that's kind of like, we'll use that. But then typically we very rarely make decisions purely off perception alone, because we need to think, okay, well, firstly, the people who are talking about stuff are like typically really angry or like, like the vocal minority, so they say. So we just need to be careful. We just need to be careful is basically what I'm saying. We do definitely take perception into account, but we usually use the perception to inform something more objective, if that makes sense. And we have a lot of objective things outside of win rates and pick rates and ban rates. Like we have game pacing, we have, like if you take the first dragon, like how much does it increase your chance to win? If you took the third dragon, or if you're on soul point, like how, or like is Herald balanced against dragon? Like those kinds of things. Like we have a lot of objective metrics to be able to determine those things.
So you really just don't put, like we're talking about, 0%, like you literally just don't really need it, you think, to balance the community perception.
No, well, the perception is like a canary in the coal mine, so to speak, right? Perception can tip us off to like a real observed problem that manifests itself in the game. But to be confident that it's actually something that is actually happening and not just like, some angry person on Reddit was saying something that's like very easy to upvote, right? Like Yuumi is like healing a lot or something, right? It's like, okay, well, I'm just going to click upvote on that, right? Like if I'm just like a random Reddit person, right? We'll need to see if like, oh, in our surveys that like actually went out to all players, right? Did people actually find Yuumi frustrating, like in aggregate? And then, we would use that to inform decisions more so than like being like some random person on Reddit said it and it got upvoted a lot.
The next question before I get into jungle stuff, what's your talk about? What does meta mean to you guys? What is meta? Is there like an ideal perfect meta in your mind, like the way that all the roles interact? Because obviously we talk a lot about this is where it gets so complicated, right? You have individual balance for champions, and then it's like then you got to think about then a meta pops up and how these interact with all each other. And
meta's a very interesting thing. So hypothetical, right? If there's a champion that is like sleeper overpowered, let's just say like Akali or like let's just say Sylas, right? Sylas, when we like buffed him like quite a few patches, like we chain buffed him in some number of patches, right?
He's really strong now.
Yeah, and he took a while to catch on, right? But it's like, is Sylas meta when he's not being played, but he's the strongest champion in the game, right? Is he? Do you guys consider him meta? Probably not, right? Because he's not being played, but he is factually like probably the strongest thing you can do. He's like the dominant strategy. So in that sense, meta is kind of like an artificial construct in that way. It's like meta doesn't necessarily represent what is factually the most powerful thing. I don't know if you guys follow like LS and stuff like that, but he's always just going on. Yeah, I think you guys don't like LS very much, but he always goes on this rant about like how things in pro play that are played are not like the optimal thing that's powerful. And I don't follow too much of LS's stuff, but people always link me that kind of thing, and I do tend to agree with that. Like, the thing that's being played in pro play is definitely not the thing that's in the pro play meta or in the high elo solo queue meta is definitely not the thing that's most powerful. We've seen that time and time again, like, hundreds and hundreds of examples. Having said that, it definitely influences the player's perception of what is the most powerful thing you can do. And so in that sense, we need to pay some attention to it. And like I said before, like for every champion, we have like this, set of indicators that'll be like, oh, we think this champion is actually like too strong to be buffed, right? Even if it's not being played. So we tend to just view meta as like a temporal artificial construct, I would say, but it definitely
it's like a living organism in a way, isn't it?
It's
just a constantly growing and evolving and changing, morphing.
Yeah. Exactly. Because to use the Sylas example, it's like, okay, well, the meta right now, if Sylas was not being played would be like, oh, it's like Izia Corki or something, right? But actually Sylas is the strongest thing you can play. So then, in 4 weeks, it might just be Sylas meta and we didn't do anything, right?
I actually think Izia is actually, I think, the strongest champ, but Sylas is like a close second.
For sure.
But the thing with Sylas though, which is really interesting, is that like people were playing Sylas suboptimally for the longest time.
Yeah.
Sylas actually there's like this really like the whole first strike thing. I'm sure you guys are aware of the whole first strike Sylas. First strike Sylas was actually, in my opinion, the optimal way to play Sylas for the longest time.
Yep.
And there was actually a Sylas one trick on my Midland Academy that told me about first strike Sylas. We're talking months ago.
Yeah.
You could have actually played this way of Sylas ever since those buffs to Sylas a while ago.
Exactly.
With secondary resolve and the whole thing. And it would have been, but it's just been undiscovered for so long. And then finally, I think like some people discovered it in like Eminez and like EU and stuff, like dominating rank 1 with it. And then like it wasn't until then people started cotton on it. And that's actually so interesting because it's not until the high elo players play and use these builds that everyone else adopts them. Yep. So it wasn't like no one really listened to this platinum Sylas player in the Midland Academy, him banging away saying you got to play first strike Sylas. No one gives a shit.
Exactly. So that's kind of like that's one of the constant struggles, right? Because we have to balance for these 4 audiences, but then the lag that happens until the thing gets strong. That's why things like Ardent Sensor meta happen, right? Because it's like, okay, well, we actually didn't change Ardent Sensor for like 6 patches or something, and it took them 6 patches to figure out that it was strong. And by the time it had picked up, like, the changes there was no chance to do changes. So
this is also probably to do with the pro player psychology, because if you think about it, pro players don't want to make risk strategies in a way a lot of the time. Like they want to do what works and what wins in scrims now. What works and wins scrims now is what's probably going to dominate the meta. Because if you were to like try and do things that don't work, it's like risking you lose that week. Like they don't think like that. It's going to take you away. It has to be a proven strategy for them to want to adopt it in a way,
Yep. The cost of innovation is so high as well. Like imagine if you're the 10th place team, right? And you're like the mid laner on the 10th place team, and you're like, hey guys, I think first strike Sylas is the strongest thing in the game. It's just like you whip it out and you lose, and it's like, okay, I mean the guy was probably right, but
there's no way to prove it.
Right? There's no way to prove it because you're the 10th place team. So it's like, and you're risking your career by doing so. So it's just like, your teammates are just gonna be like, what the fuck are you doing, dude? Like, why are you playing first strike Sylas and just griefing our scrims like 5 games in a row? It's like, so it's just like
because a lot of the feeling if something is strong is it's usually intuitive anyway. Like a lot of the time players can't articulate why something is strong. Like they have a hunch that, like this guy had a hunch that it's strong and he's trying to explain to me, but League, I believe, is like 85% feel. Like it's a feel-oriented game, and if you can't articulate it and you haven't personally felt the strength, then it doesn't really matter. That's why it doesn't even matter in the first place.
Yeah, it's a fascinating meta is a very interesting topic. We have to grapple with it every day. It's very,
and that's actually kind of reiterates our take on meta, where it's actually not that important. Like your take and your feel and your interpretation of how to win the game. Actually it's actually more important than the meta itself, as long as you understand how to deal with whatever's in the meta at the current time.
Like you see this in chess as well, right? Where it's like there might be like a dominant set of openings that are played by humans, and then you like look at what the computer's doing and you're just like, okay, our meta is just like complete useless. Like the computer's just doing all this wacky stuff and just like owning us, and like it's like, what is meta even at that point then?
That's so interesting. Imagine if League will get to a point where there is like League like AI that it's able to like understand what the most optimal way to play a given meta is. That'd be insane.
Well, you see, the interesting thing though is, don't you think that what Riot's done or what you guys have done over the last years, like there's a top jungle mid support ADC, right? You talk about that chess example.
Yep.
But balance is towards that, aren't you always pushing towards those 5 roles?
Yeah, so we are. But we are for 2 reasons, right? Because one is our goal is not to create the most balanced game, if that makes sense. Balance is like a one input into the most fun game, right? Like arguably, like our goal is to create the most fun game, right? And balance is one input to making a fun game. It's not the only input. It's one of the inputs. It's a very important input. But to that point, it's also about like making what players think is fun. So if we were like, oh, okay, well, actually we're not going to balance towards the 5 roles and we're going to make it so that you play 2-1-2 with no jungler. It's like, would League players even find that fun? It's just like, oh, we've erased the jungle role and now we've made the jungler like play Targon's top lane. It's like, It's like you wouldn't
Okay,
like
I'd
that,
say,
right?
Yeah, that's so
You'd just be like,
interesting.
oh man, I hate this game. I don't want to play anymore. And you would just quit,
Mm.
right? It's like when we did mages in the bot lane in patch 8.11, right? It's like the AD carry players rebelled because they were just like, I don't want to play against Vlad with ancient coin or whatever things were prevalent back then, right? So it's a lot about like we want to make the most fun game, right? We don't necessarily and champion variety and champion balance are like important inputs into what makes the game fun. But they also incur cost when they are like added in and players don't initially like it.
But I think there's also here that humans don't like change, and League has created this structure when it was initially came out, right? Where there's like the AD carry marksman in the bot lane with like some form of like supportive utility champion in support, like some major assassin mid and a bruiser tanky top, and then like some whatever jungle, right? Like it could be anything really, tank or carry jungle. But it almost feels like because that's the way the game was played for such a long time, and that's now what people are used to, anything that runs counter to that narrative that's being created is automatically going to be viewed as unfun. Mm-hmm. Even if in a way, like you could run a thought experiment. It's like if the game came out and it actually wasn't this, there was no jungle, and then there was actually two people on top and then two people on bot. Even if that was quote unquote a more objectively more fun way to play the game, like it wouldn't even matter because we're so used to this way of playing, right? So that's like an interesting thing. Like Riot would probably have to deal with, right? It's like, well, what do people just genuinely? What are they used to? So we got to change, but we can't change too much because people just get too uncomfortable.
Have you heard of the concept of boiling the frog? So it's like the frog is in a pot of water, and the water is going up by like half a degree every minute. And the frog doesn't perceive it's being boiled, but eventually the frog's like, oh shit, this water's like actually kind of hot. And it's like, oh fuck, I'm being boiled, right? That's kind of like a way of like kind of like analogizing what you just said, which is like you want to change some amount, but you don't want to change too much that the frog is like, ah shit, like the water's hot, right? So it's kind of that thing. So that's kind of like the way that I view change. It's like you want to change some amount, right, to add novelty and to add variety, but you don't want to change too much at once. And arguably, like in patch 8.11, we might have tried to change too much at once. The core idea makes the game healthier long-term, right? The fact that you don't have to play a marksman in bot lane makes the game healthier long-term. But making a gigantic like shift where it's like, all right, now all these like mages and fighters are in your lane is probably like too big of a swing at once. And that's kind of like what we learned with like the Juggernaut update and patch 8.11 and
that was what was Garen Yumi in bot as well. I think it was Garen Yumi in bot lane and all this weird stuff.
Right. And obviously like there's bad cases like of that, like with Garen Yumi and stuff like that. But yeah, some change is good. Changing players' perceptions of like what is optimal and what is fun, and say like adding pike support, right? An assassin in the support role. It's like, wow, that's like really it's quite disruptive if you're playing like, I don't know, like an enchanter or something, and you're like, now I'm getting one shot by the support, and that's like really weird. But it's like, yeah, just small steps.
I guess it makes me think about, people get really upset, like champs can just snowball out of control. There's very little counterplay. Mm-hmm. That's actually really fun for that play, and those things should exist. Like I think about things like Fizz, and people complain about Samira and stuff like that. Mm-hmm. But it's like, I'm now thinking from their perspective, it's like that Samira person's just having a blast, right?
They're never going to quit.
You know what I mean?
Because they're playing for that high again, right?
Yeah. They're just playing for that next high. Like, even though that, there is, I mean, Samira is definitely very bad in certain team comps against like heavy range and stuff like that. So there is counterplay. Same as Fizz, right? So yeah, I mean, it's definitely very interesting about the whole fun versus, it's just going to be impossible to actually balance. And yes, it's not even your guys' priority, it sounds like. It's just, as you said, it's an aspect of the game, balance.
Yeah. I mean, obviously balance is extremely important, right? Like, I'm not trying to say balance isn't important. It's something that we think about a lot, right? But I'm just saying that it's not the only thing that makes the game fun. Yeah. There are many other things at play. That's like, the strategic variety of champions that you can play, the strategy of team comps, the strategy of how you play around objectives. Like if you have to play top side versus you have to play bot side. If split is the dominant strategy, is different to if stacking souls is a dominant strategy, or if like Rift taking first two rifts and taking 0 dragons and then fighting for third dragon, right? If that's the dominant strategy, then it's like like if the game is solved on like any number of axes, then it gets stale. And so our challenge is basically, how do we maximize all of these like infinite jigsaw pieces to make the most fun game? So it's like almost an impossible task at times, but yeah.
Nathan, before you get onto your jungle spiel, I want to ask a question. Phroxzon, have you read the book Principles by Ray Dalio?
No, but I think I like looked at the summary at some point.
Right. The reason I ask is that, but the premise of that book, Ray Dalio, like this, he's like kind of like a financial guy, and he ran this company where his philosophy in life was about basically having painful experiences and creating principles that they can use moving forward to tackle similar problems.
Yep.
At Riot, in the balance team, do you guys have a series of kind of principles that you use based off past experiences that you kind of regurgitate and to kind of learn from? Would you mind sharing some of these principles with us?
1,000,000%. A lot of things that have happened are due to like painful lessons and introspection and like reflection on the process and how it went. And sometimes it's like, it can be hard to pinpoint what exactly went wrong, right? So it does take a lot of like root cause analysis to try and figure out like what went wrong. As for some of the principles, can you like narrow it down for me? Like what?
Well, maybe just some of your favorites, some of your personal favorites, some that you use often.
So I have a lot of principles for like game design craft itself, but that's like not particularly relevant for this discussion, because like what people don't understand is that like game design itself is just like it's so completely separate. It's like learning like law or something or computers. Right. Like people don't understand how complex it is to be a game designer, like by any stretch. They'll be like, I can do what they did, but it's very difficult. For balance stuff, let's see. I mean, boiling the frog is one of them, right? Like you shouldn't do too much change at once.
Incremental changes.
Yeah. There are some other ones. Man, I'm just trying to think. The fringe case is like one of them, right? Like determining whether an item is contributing too much or too little. There's another one which is like a little more experiential, but adding mana options in runes makes it difficult to balance champions because it creates design debt. So let's say, for example, you're trying to balance Gangplank, right? Gangplank's early game trading, right? Which on the previous patch was a problem, right? Where he would just like queue you relentlessly. It's like, well, how do you balance that? You can balance that with like multiple different ways, right? You can make him easier to all in. You can nerf his base AD so his Q doesn't hit as hard. You could nerf his Q cooldown. You could nerf his Q mana. But wait, if you nerf his Q mana, but there are mana options in the rune tree, then he can just subvert that nerf. He can just change from, because back in the day, he didn't take biscuits, right? But then we nerfed his mana because we were like, oh, well, he shouldn't be able to Q so much in lane, right? In early lane. And then he was like, oh, well, jokes, I'm just going to like swap my splash to be inspiration and take biscuits and solve my mana problem, right? And so there are things like mana in the rune trees create design debt and make it and remove one lever for champions. This was the same thing with Yuumi. We tried to gate her E around using it and running out of mana. With jokes, we also made presence of mind. So she just took presence of mind and subverted all the nerfs that we were trying to do to her, right? So it's like there's this principle of what's called design debt, which anytime you make a game design change, it has a forward-facing implication on any possible design decision that you could make in the future. Viego is an example of this. Anytime you make an ultimate, you need to think about how it could be used on Viego. Anytime you make, on Sylas. Anytime you make a basic ability, you have to think about Viego can turn into that, right? And these are, things called design debt. So there's a billion of these. I can't think of many off the top of my head, but the mana should be like pretty illustrative in terms of like the things that game designers have to think about in terms of balance.
Really interesting.
Yeah, it's incredibly complex. It's kind of crazy. There's also things like burst damage thresholds. So it's like, oh, well, if we deliver a burst damage option as a keystone, it's like we need to consider how that's going to break a champion that's at what we consider like a 95% burst threshold. So if a champion uses their kit and it gets a typical AD carry to 5% health. If we introduce a damage keystone where they previously weren't taking a damage keystone, let's say they were taking phase rush or something, they might take the damage keystone and now be over the burst threshold, right? And so you need to think about, which champions would optimally use this keystone and all the miners, and is the keystone enough to overcome taking bad miners? It's just there's a lot of these principles.
Fascinating.
Well, I've definitely learned a lot about game design and definitely hearing the possibilities. Yeah, I mean, I always just think, everyone says it's like, oh, I'm like, why don't I own the balance team and stuff like that? It's like, I'm not touching that.
No, I'm staying well away from that.
You've just convinced me further here, Phroxzon.
It's crazy. The complexities of like making a single decision are just like they could have years worth of impact, right? If I made a rune that was like, oh, it just gave it, like, let's say I made this is one of the reasons why we don't put early sustain in rune trees, right? Because it just systemically removes a balancing lever for us to use on a champion. So like, let's say, for example, Taste of Blood, like on Vladimir. Like, let's say we were like, oh, actually the weakness to Vladimir is that you play Orianna or Victor and you push him under the tower and you just like infinitely wave clear and he can't harass you and you space him, right? And then it'd be like, oh, well, actually we made a rune that like let him just face tank all of your stuff. Then it's like, okay, now Vladimir is unbalanceable. And it's like, oh no, we've created like 3 years worth of design debt by making this one rune, basically.
Yeah, runes are actually they're actually massively game changing. I didn't actually realize. I always thought of items, but runes are actually massive.
Yeah. And runes is not something that you want to you don't really want to change, like add a new rune randomly, because you got just remove, right? You got like 3, 4, 4. So that's So in terms of like, like what do you sacrifice? What's the first sacrifice? Like, does it go champion, items, then runes? Like you want to ideally not touch?
That's correct. Yeah, champions, items, runes.
Yeah,
in that order. And champions are like significantly higher than both items and runes. Yeah.
All right, so moving on to the jungle now. So Phroxzon, you talked about how there's in the team you have like the owners of each role. It sounds like you're the mid person, right?
No, I own everything. So like, let's say like let's say someone needs a call on something, right? So let's say we want to put 25 changes in the patch. Let's say, for example, right? And we'll be like, we're deciding between this thing and this thing. I'll be like, okay, well, present your arguments for this thing. I'll present my arguments, and then I'll say, okay, based on the argument, I think we should do this. Or I might like decide what the strategy for the patch is. If I was like, we've been very buff heavy the last 3 patches, right? Which results in power creep, which is another design principle, which is to say, doing more buffs than nerfs over an extended period of time just increases the amount of damage in the game, right? So if we were power creeping, then I'd be like, I think we should be a little nerf heavy these patches. And so we would construct the patch like that. So I tend to do like the overall vision for the patch, as well as be like, hey, aren't we buffing too many like sources of sustain? Like we should probably cut like a few of those. So that's kind of like how that plays out. But anyways, continue.
Because I got confused because you guys have been talking about mid the whole time. So I'm like,
it's because I'm a mid laner.
So you're passionate about mid.
He just plays mid.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So I'm really curious about jungle because I mean, the thing about me is that in terms of my journey, I didn't really play the game for a big chunk because I was running dials from 2014 onwards. So I don't know if there's other examples of this, but what really was really interesting in terms of how impactful changes was the Udyr Hecarim meta last year.
Yeah.
Talking about how once the full clear level 4 stuff, like it actually sort of just breaks the game, or just like literally creates a meta in the jungle. In terms of clear speed, and clear speed's a really interesting one compared to anything else, because jungle, it's like, minions are minions, right? It affects all lanes, but jungle is just like, you can decide whether a champ becomes a jungle or not based on, here's the numbers, here's the reduced numbers. Like, there's been examples of Talon and stuff. So and I've seen lots of blogs, right? You guys have posted over the years talking about how you want some of the beginner champs to become junglers to help beginner-friendly champ, players, and then we saw things like Morgana become a jungler and all that sort of stuff, right? And Rumble and stuff. So, how do you guys think about deciding when to add a new jungle? Do you guys want champs to straight up not be junglers? You talked about Silas. Silas was originally a jungler, and you guys just deleted him basically because of reducing the auto attack reset. So, I'd love to get your thoughts on this. How you guys think about jungle and
really
hitting camps?
Yeah, really interesting question. Okay, so for jungle specifically, jungle kind of like suffers from a few different problems. One is that you don't directly play against another player. So for example, in Western regions, jungle is jungle. People tend to get auto-filled into jungle quite often.
Curtis is passionate about that.
Yeah.
I don't want to talk about. I get so angry about autofill. Just don't even mention it around me, please.
So basically, we tried to subvert some of those problems by saying, okay, well, what if we take a bunch of popular champions and try and bolster the desire to play in that role? So that's like some of the reasons, right? Because it's like, oh, if you're a Darius player, right? You'd be like, oh, well, maybe I'll give Jungle Darius a try, right? And we might put something there. Now, the game pays a long-term cost for doing this, right? Because two things. One, players don't intuitively imagine Morgana to be played in jungle for whatever reason, or Zyra, right? It's not like the natural thing that you would assume. And secondly, the game pays a complexity cost, which is to say that the game becomes fractionally or marginally harder to learn, right? Because you need to understand now that Morgana can jungle, or when you're reading Morgana's tooltips, it takes 1 second longer to read them, right? So the game pays, over time, like a cost in terms of like complexity. So we will typically like make an assessment like, okay, well, should we put this champion in jungle? It probably improves the role health of the jungle by a little bit, but we pay a cost in terms of like how easy the game is to learn, and we might pay a game health cost, right? The number of AP junglers that are viable dictates the number of AD mids that are viable, right? And that has implications on pro play, and that has implications on the meta, and has implications on the way objectives are balanced against each other. So there's all of these costs that we have to consider. In Silas's case, for example, we were like, okay, well, we can't balance him for 3 roles. He was like a triple flex. He was like horrible win rate in solo queue. His jungle win rate was always the worst out of the 3, like top, mid, and jungle. And so we were like, okay, well, we can't balance Silas for 3 roles and 4 audiences. So we just decided to take jungle out because it was the lowest affinity of the 3. And it presented some game health problems. When Silas is not lane locked, he can pick any ultimate on the map. And that presented a game health challenge. And on top of that, the designer didn't want Silas to be a jungler. So that was that.
So yeah, that's really interesting. I never thought of it. Again, it sounds like the catering to also the general player base is really important. Talking about the autofill, and talking about allowing people to play other champions. And again, you always bring it back to those 4 audiences that you need to hit, which definitely makes things complicated.
Yeah.
In terms of what you talk about in terms of your view of the way, obviously jungle sort of separated into like, you're maybe more of a farming jungle, or you're more facilitated jungle. And so as we've seen over the, the course of, especially with champs like Belveth and stuff released, she's very weak early. Viega, you could say he sort of could do things, early game, but he wants to play for those team fights.
Yep.
Do you guys have an idea of where you want jungle to be headed? Do you want it to be a facilitated? Do you want to be to more, or you want it to, or you're always trying to balance the two? You want to give both options to players?
We don't think of the role in terms of, there are very few roles that we think in terms of this role should do a certain thing. When we think of a role like that, it generally like tends to limit design space. So it would, if we, for example, were to say, well, support role should be enchanters and tanks, and then we would never make something like Pyke, right? So it's very limiting in terms of like, and you could argue that maybe someone hates Pyke and they're like, yeah, Pyke was terrible for the game, but we would argue that Pyke is like good for the game because it like, it allows you to play an assassin from the support role, and that's a novel experience and that kind of thing. So what we tend to do is we say, okay, what are the subset of audiences that enjoy playing this role and like derive enjoyment from it? And then we'll say, are those play styles like adequately represented in the champions that you can play in the role? Like if, for example, we've had periods of time in years past where like bruisers were just like completely useless, like just as a class, like every single bruiser was weak. This was like many years ago. Then we might say, okay, well, we're letting bruiser players down because they can't play something that is viable. Like they feel like when they're queuing up, they're just griefing their team by playing bruisers. And so they have to play something that they don't enjoy playing. So what we tend to do is we tend to make sure that all of the subclasses are like balanced. as well as making sure that all the champions are balanced within a role. So there's definitely a strategic layer of as many things should be viable at once within a role, with a focus on the champions. That's kind of how we think about it. So if you're talking about the farming junglers, we don't want to make it so that the only thing you can play is farming junglers. Ideally, that's the case, but sometimes, like in the case of like Udyr Hecarim, like we did have a period where it was like you could basically only play farming junglers because the value of full clearing was like so high. But it's not the intended state.
Okay. So talking about when you guys adjusted the jungle spawn camps from like 2 minutes 30 seconds to 2 minutes, and then you went back to 2:15. So I mean, what actually attracted me to the jungle role? I thought jungle role was broken by concept. That's actually where it came from, because I was just like, wait, I can play a champion. I don't have to interact with anyone, and I can just get really strong just by and then just play for fights and stuff like that, and just be like super tanky. And again, you talk about that, you don't really think that way, but for jungle's different, because jungle is about the clearest, like you can literally not interact with anyone, and you can just take camps all the time, right? But obviously, you talked about that balance. I mean, you guys did like the balance, and I think it is in a really good position now at 2:15. But if you guys start adjusting that again, isn't that sort of demonstrating where you want the role to be?
Yeah. So we might do that for reasons other than the balance of farming or ganking junglers. So that is one tool that we can use. It's a very disruptive tool. But we might make that change for some other esoteric reason, such as jungle is too high stress, right? It's completely unrelated to balance, right? We might be like, oh, well, junglers actually feel overwhelmed when all their camps are up all the time. You're paralyzed by the number of decisions that you can make, right? That's not even related to balance at all, right? So we're beholden to some higher level game design principles of what makes the game fun, right? As well at the same time. So, obviously if we did that, if we were like, oh, well, the root cause of junglers being too high stress is the number of decisions you can make, we might be like, okay, well, let's take the camp timers back, but this is going to unbalance the balance of farming versus ganking junglers. And then we would need to do an adjustment to the farming and ganking junglers. So that's why I was saying any change that we do is going to incur some cost, and we need to be able to forecast how much cost that is going to be, basically, and make sure that the decisions that we're making are paying the appropriate cost for the appropriate value that we're gaining from it. So we might be like, oh, well, junglers are really high stress right now, but we can't afford to make farming junglers that much better, or or ganking junglers that much better, or vice versa. So it's just like a complicated equation, basically.
Talking about now, you've made the blog post and you've done the durability patch. I always find it's really interesting, the whole tank versus assassin, and the way you guys think about balancing, because I think that it's really interesting, because it sort of just goes, I mean, it feels like it always just goes one direction to the other. Have you guys found, in terms of the durability patch, you're closer to where do you guys want it to be? Like, is there an ideal situation, or are we just happy for it to, this is the time when we're going to be, tanks are going to be a little bit stronger than now?
Like, are you saying is it meant to be a constant flux between the two, or is it always, you want it to get to a point where you can actually both are equally viable, right?
Yeah.
I think if both are equally viable, that's the optimal state. Yeah. I think cycling the meta has some values. But overall, I think it's better if everything is viable at once, and that allows us to focus our attention elsewhere. So, if you think of it in terms of this way, like, let's say I have X number of game design resources, right? If I have to allocate, 50% of that to balancing the game, because, things just keep going in and out of balance, it means that that's 50% less game design resources to do fun things like, I don't know, like preseason or something, right? Or I don't know, like new items or whatever, right? Not to say that balance is I strictly view balance as a cost, like a game design cost, but there are definitely costs in terms of like what we could be doing, like an opportunity cost to keep the game balanced, if that makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of the interesting thing when I think about the whole tanks is like the items scale like really poorly at the moment. Like, let's say if you're, because you just build Lord Doms and that sort of stuff, like you can eat through these like
Yeah,
again
Void.
is that, I mean, is that just again the problem of like your champion item and then runes? Like you guys just need to find that champion item sort of balance for tanks.
Yeah. And sometimes it's not even as simple as just like making them more or less powerful, because like you saw what happened when we buffed Sunfire Cape, and now Diana and Muskie and Yone buy it, right? And it's just like, okay, well, you know, you can't like, sometimes you can't just like straight up buff things, because then some other like downstream consequences going to happen, right? So it's like sometimes these things will take like a more significant like rework to get right. Like it might be like, oh, the current tank items are unable to serve their purpose and we can't just like buff them up and down. We need like new items or something like that. Like that might be the problem that we've identified. Sometimes it might be, yeah, we just make the items stronger or weaker, or we make the champions stronger or weaker, which is kind of like the situation we're in right now. Yeah.
I feel like tank items, when I think of like tank metas in the past, like I feel like tanks were really strong for a long period of time in earlier seasons, right? Where like remember, especially in top lane, where like there was so much Sion and Maokai and Ornn and there was all those champs. And then obviously like Gnar came into the meta, and then Gnar would be like pick into Maokai.
What was the items they were building in those stages though? I forgot. What was it? It was like
Sunfire, Spirit Visage, and all that stuff, right? And it almost felt like my take on this was like tanks of, I've always felt intuitively that tanks were really hard to balance, because when tanks are really strong, it kind of like it's both anti-fun, but also it almost feels like they automatically do damage without taking damage. It always feels like tanks are really hard to damage. Is that something that you guys have noticed?
Mm-hmm. So let's think about like why tanks are like inherently difficult to balance, right? Tanks scale off multiple axes, right? Defensive stats are like inherently multiplicative by nature, as are offensive stats. So like, let's say, for example, you have attack damage, you have attack speed, you have critical strike, and you have armor pen, right? That's 4 multipliers. For tanks, you have like health and armor and magic resist, right? So the way that we want to make it so that the offensive power can always beat through the defensive power, right? Because otherwise you get 0-0 farming meta. But also there are like implications on like how much, how good should AD carries be at killing tanks versus how good should they be at killing other people, right? So if let's say, for example, we had a situation where we're like, okay, well, tanks are too strong. So what we should do is we should hyper-focus AD carries on being able to kill tanks. So we changed Last Whisper into being bonus armor penetration, right? And the implication of that is that AD carries become better at killing tanks, but they become worse at killing squishies, right? The downstream consequence of that was that because assassins also built armor penetration, assassins became worse at killing tanks, which means that for them to be balanced, they need to be better at killing squishies, right? So in changing AD carries to be better at killing tanks, we actually make assassins better at killing squishies. Like, does that make sense?
Interesting. That makes perfect sense.
And so because the assassins become weaker because they built Last Whisper, but now we have to balance, we can't have the assassins be weak. So then the assassins are better like at killing squishies. So those are like a lot of the downstream consequences of why tanks were difficult to balance, because we're like, okay, well, if AD carries are meant to be killing tanks, then we should give them bonus armor penetration. But that just makes assassins kill squishies, and now squishies are miserable. You know, so that's like it's such a difficult to strike. But yeah.
And I've always felt that tanks are now harder to balance more than ever, also with the amount of healing in the game. I found as well. I feel like back in the day there was way less healing in the game, and it felt like now, especially with the amount of healing in the game, like because you know how obviously they have a lot of HP and then the armor resistances. Every little bit of healing matters more, right? Because it's harder to get through that HP. Yep. And I've always felt like this. That healing in general as well is another very difficult. Like sustained and healing in general is a very difficult stat or concept to really like balance.
Yeah, for sure.
What do you think about that?
So there's a few things. There's a few reasons why we use healing. One is it's a satisfying tool, right, to deliver defensive mechanics. It has some innate properties that are different to just giving someone raw health, right? Which is like, okay, fights are swingy and harder to estimate, right? So it's less deterministic in that sense. So like combats can play out in more dynamic ways, right? And secondly, it's just an expectation, right? Like if you run into a vampire, you would expect a vampire to heal, right? Probably.
You're right. You can't find another way to find an excuse to not have it in the game in a way.
Yeah, I mean, we could, but it's like it's like weird. You'd be like, okay, well, why is this sword person shooting you with a gun, right? Like Gangplank, right? it's like okay, well, like why is he doing that, right? Like
that's going back to game design again.
Game design. There's all these things that are getting in a way we don't understand game design. So things that like. It's like I always wish that League actually there was actually no such thing as like healing, but it actually makes no sense from a game design perspective.
Exactly, it's not intuitive. It also like has pacing value, right? Like if nobody's health bars ever changed dynamically, you would just be able to know immediately who's going to win the fight, right? You would never be able to forecast whether Aatrox, like if Aatrox just had 3,000 health, right, instead of healing for 1,000 mid combat. You'd be like, okay, well, I'm just never going to fight that guy, right? I'm never going to kill him, right? But as soon as you add healing into it, which is dynamic, and we can add things like, oh, okay, well, now fights can play out dynamically because it matters if he got a 3-proc Gore Drinker or he got a 4-proc Gore Drinker, or if he got a Gore Drinker when his ultimate was active or he didn't, right? And so healing is a very interesting tool to create a lot of depth in tactical combat, as well as just intuitive expectation of playing the genre. So,
and I also feel like healing as well, it would be really difficult to balance. Like champs like Soraka and Yuumi and stuff would be very difficult to balance within the different audiences, like between like the lower elo brackets and the high elo brackets. I feel like that would be a massive task.
It's quite difficult. So like Yuumi has been like quite difficult to balance, but I think she's in like as sustainable a spot as she as close to a sustainable spot as she could be for a champion that like kind of goes untargetable for like the majority of the game. She's definitely been like difficult to balance, but I would say in general, like healing champions are tough to balance, but they are an expectation. So we should put the extra effort into balance them, basically. There's another thing where it's like, okay, now we're opening a whole other can of worms about like systemic outlets, right? It's like, okay, well, how much does it matter that you buy grievous wounds against a healer? How much should it matter? And what are the downstream consequences of it mattering, right? So let's say, for example, what are the consequences of grievous wounds being at 40% versus grievous wounds being at 60%? And what are the consequences of grievous wounds being available in 30% of games compared to grievous wounds being in 60% of games, right? So to give you just a quick example, it's like, okay, well, grievous wounds at 60% compared to 40% presented a lot of different challenges. One was to come back to the champion design debt problem, we couldn't make champions that healed a lot as their power budget, as a large percentage of their power budget, because they were just getting grievous wounds all the time, which meant that we would need to make the healing tools significantly stronger than they should be on paper to be satisfying. But as a result of that, it also meant that if nobody bought grievous wounds against this champion, it would automatically win, right? It would just automatically win. Yeah. And who doesn't buy grievous wounds against these champions? Low elo players, right?
Right. Yeah.
And so now by making grievous wounds at 60% compared to 40%, you're making a champion that is probably low elo skewed, right? And that's like a 3 to 4 step downstream consequence of grievous wounds being 60% compared to 40%. Wow. So it's just like, okay, well, now any healing champion that you make with grievous wounds at 60% healing is probably going to be low elo skewed. And that's like, it's just, yeah. So imagine that times like, yeah, it's just crazy.
How complicated this whole game design thing is. Just unbelievable.
Yeah. I mean, this has been very educational.
It's been huge. Yeah.
I definitely understand a lot more about.
I actually, as a side note, I don't think healing reduction is in a good spot right now in mid lane specifically. It doesn't feel intuitive. It doesn't make sense to build healing reduction in mid lane at all, and you're almost always reliant on your support building it. And if you don't have an enchanter that can't apply grievous wounds, it just feels it doesn't feel right. There's something not right. And again, I don't really have the solution. It just doesn't feel right. So
So it's like, it's our job, because I agree, right? And it's our job to figure out what the solution for that is without like basically creating 3 years of champion design debt, right? Which is like,
I trust you guys. You sound pretty professional.
It's very hard. So, but generally speaking, like our philosophy on grievous wounds, and there's going to be a blog post coming out about this in a few days, but it's we don't want people to have to buy Grievous Wounds against one heavy healer. So like one Soraka, one
that's so good to hear.
One Aatrox. But as a result, that means that we need to reduce the healing of those champions, like to a level where their innate kit counterplay is the thing that is the determination of the success, right? So, for example, if it was like, hey, you even if you do everything correctly against a champion, they're still out healing your damage, then something's probably wrong, right? If you're like, oh, I dodged all of Aatrox's Qs and he was still able to tank all of my damage as Orianna and kill me, I'd be like, oh, okay, well, something's probably wrong, right?
Right.
And we need to figure out where that sweet spot is, basically, and iteratively move them down.
Couldn't you apply to a lot of these kits? Like, I've always thought that why don't Riot add things to kits that, like, you need to tick multiple boxes that add value, that lead to having more valuable healing. So it, like, something that doesn't make sense to me was when Soraka has like just one ability, like you just click one ability and you instantly get that healing. Yep. Like in my mind, it should be that like if you land the Q, it then applies some, and then you get like a thing on you, and then that gives you extra healing. Like it always felt like to me, healing champions in the game, it's too easy for them to heal. Yeah. And I feel like there should be more like extra barriers needed to tick in order to get max value from the healing. That way you don't have to add necessarily more Grievous Wounds into the game. You're automatically...
It's more of a skill thing.
Yeah, it's more skill to the healing in a way. Or maybe make the healing a skill shot. Like things like that where...
Next champion idea, champion that throws the support.
Like, so because that way you're directly bypassing itemization and having to like all runes. It's directly on the champion itself. That's why for me, point and clicks heals... Things like that's why Yuumi healing and Soraka healing from I mean, I'm not a game, I don't know jack shit about game design, but it's just something didn't feel right to me. That's just my 2 cents.
Okay, so here's another instance of game design strikes again. But it's there are 2 like higher principles here, right? What does the audience of those champions like to do? And secondly, like how much complexity cost can we incur for a given champion? So we might say, let's say that the target for the champion was like, this champion should be like a medium complexity champion, which is to say, right? And we'd be like, oh, okay, well, this audience of player that we're targeting is looking for a medium complexity experience, right? And we'd be like, okay, well, now Soraka's W is a skill shot. It's like, okay, well, now we're alienating like some amount of audience that is looking for an experience. And hopefully, we've balanced, I mean, in Soraka's case, it's probably not like a great case for like we've balanced her well, but it's like she was meant to pay other strategic costs for having that point and click healing, right? She's meant to be slow. She has 325 base move speed. She has no instant CC. She only has a delayed route on her E. She's kind of like easy to catch out, and she needs to be in short range to her target that she's healing. Those are meant to be, the ways that healing ability is balanced while meeting the medium complexity thing. Because moving slow is not like something that you have to dedicate any mind share to, right?
Right, yeah.
Having said that, we probably haven't like completely balanced it properly to the point where it's like, like completely fair to play against on both sides. But I would say that there's like a tendency of particularly high skilled players like yourselves, or even like me compared to the general population, right? Like even if I'm like, plat 1 D4, I'm still like in the top 1%, right? It's like there's a very common tendency for high skilled players to solve all problems by making the kits more complicated. And that's just not good for the long-term health of the game. Imagine if we were like, hey, actually all 150 characters, like in order to balance them, we added an extra paragraph of text to one ability. And is the game better on account of that? It might be more balanced, but it's probably worse. It's probably a worse game.
It's not good for the general player base and again all the casual gamers.
Yeah, exactly.
You just want an easy to play champion. You need easy to play champions in every role, is what you're saying as well. Yeah.
Because imagine this, right? Imagine you come home from work, right? And you're like, I could choose to play League of Legends or I could choose to play Valorant, right? Or like Counter-Strike or something. It's like, my champion is so complicated that I need 1,000 hours to like play it at like a reasonable level. It's like, well, why would I play Garen if now I have to like do DDR inputs to like just pass my E, right? It's like, but for you and for me, I'd be like, oh, well, that champion's probably more fair, right? Like, because he has to like do something,
like, I see what you mean.
To do it, right? But
we need. That's why I'm not working at Riot.
Yeah, we need to be just, and so like we're going to pay some trade-offs somewhere, right? Yeah. Like there are champions that high elo players will be like, well, this is really unskilled that you can just press a button and like win combat sometimes. But champions like that need to exist, and I think this is things like Malzahar winning worlds. It's like sometimes those champions need to exist, and it's healthy for different types of players. Maybe players that over-index in strategic skills but are not so good at landing skill shots and stuff. It's valuable for people to express their skill in different ways, right?
Mm. So, yeah. I think you guys did a really great job of that with Swain. Mm-hmm. I think the Swain rework was really well done, where it's like it's a champ that has a great. It's not overly mechanical. It has really intuitive abilities. It's got a cool identity. I think Swain and all the Swain mains in my Discord love it. They thought it was like a really great rework, and I think that's a perfect example of a champ that it's got that perfect balance of ease of execution, but it's got like a little bit of complexity, but the complexity isn't overwhelming to people.
Exactly.
Yeah, I think that's
like
really
imagine
great.
The really bad case of this is like the only champions that are viable in pro play have the skill input difficulty of Azir. It's like
just ridiculous.
That's just a disaster, right? Like it's so bad. Like you're only catering towards one subset of player that has high mechanical skill. And in the long term, it means that high elo players only develop that skill, right? They don't over-index into champions they don't ever index into champions that have a higher strategic skill test and a lower mechanical skill test, as an example.
And it's actually good that the pro players will play basic champions, because as the average viewer who's getting excited about the game, who wants to tune into pro play, say, that guy's playing Garen or whatever, or Malphite. Yep. Oh, I can do that. Like I can also play that champion and do that.
No, I think that's the beauty of League of Legends.
Yeah.
That's game design value strikes again, which is like there's an aspirational value of seeing things that are different, that are viable, right? Like you're like, oh, I play Yuumi, I can play Yuumi. I can just press W and like sit on somebody and then just press E periodically. I mean, obviously Yuumi is like a lot more difficult than that, but like, there is aspirational value in saying, hey, I saw that person do that, and I'm gonna load up a solo queue and game and do that. Like we've seen this time and time again. Like someone randomly plays Warwick in competitive play, and suddenly like Warwick's play rate like skyrockets, right? It's like I can do that. I can play Warwick.
It was like Lehens with was it Singe?
Yeah, Singe
and police support and stuff like
exactly. that. Support, yeah. And so it's just like there's aspirational values for simple champions being played at the highest level, even though they quote unquote don't take skill. But it's because that champion probably indexes higher in like strategic skill. It's not something that's immediately visible to see someone that's out macroing you, or maybe the champion just takes less skill, and that's okay, right? Like it's okay that someone can play Malzahar, and Malzahar is easier to play than Orianna, right? Like it's fine. It's actually a good thing.
Totally agree.
Yeah.
All right, the last thing from my notes here, I want to talk about game pace. How you guys think about that? Obviously, in the blog post, the mid-season changes, durability patch, you guys talked about you guys really think team fighting is really fun for the game, and games, obviously back in season 2, games will go for 60 minutes, 50 minutes on average. I think that everyone can agree that's not fun.
Yep.
What do you guys think about game pace?
Just generally, so the game is. Okay, so
do you guys have like a time? Like you guys want the games to end on average? Like how do you guys look at the thing and be like, okay, we want games to end by 20, maybe 27 minutes. So like we're going to make changes towards that.
So generally, the status quo is like elite games end in about 25 minutes. Skilled games end in about 27 minutes, and average games end in about 29 to 30 minutes. That feels about roughly the right amount to get. So to go for game design value strikes again, we want valuable pacing for like the laning phase should matter. And there should be a clear separation between laning phase and mid game. And there should be a clear separation between mid game and late game. And it should feel like some games are just over in mid game, and some games it should feel they go really long, right? And so we definitely have a set of game buckets and distributions that we generally feel like the game is in a good spot. So this is like, I don't know, maybe like we use this term called trapped games, which is to say at 15 minutes, is the game 90% over, right? Like, is there a 90% chance of winning the game at 15 minutes? We tend to think that a good value for that is about 25%, 23%. It depends by patch. So this is to say that 23% of games are like 90% decided. So this is like your 4 kills and the enemy's like 15. And you're just like, okay, I want to FF. That has downstream implications on the way that the mid-game and late-game distributions play out. So that feels about roughly the right amount of game pace for us that leaves the early game, mid-game, and late game in like a good amount of distributions, if that makes sense. And then on top of that, there's like the strategy layer, which is to say, should teams be able to stack dragons as a win condition, or should they be able to play for heralds and like go for more tempo and gold and that kind of stuff? So there's also that balancing lever that we also need to keep in check. So those are the two main ones. It's like, is the balance of the map objectives correct, and is the distribution of games in the game buckets correct?
Because as you've talked about before, especially with the durability patch, people said that the game pace.
Yeah, it went.
People said it was like, going to be slower. But from your experience.
No, it was slow at the very start, but I feel like that was like a placebo effect. Like the durability patch happened, and then I think everyone was automatically trading less in a way. It was like everyone's so much tankier, so I don't want to trade. So and people opted in for more scaling runes. And then I think people realized, well, the game really hasn't changed as much as we think it does, and people like adapted, and then it's like picked up in pace. And I feel like the game is kind of similar to what it used to be back even before, in terms of feel, in terms of game pace before the durability patch. Personally, at least in the high elo games.
Yep.
But I always talk about game pace a lot, because game pace in high elo is like a huge thing. Like that basically dictates your runes and your itemization massively. Yep. I mean, that's probably the number one thing that I think about in terms of itemization. Like, what's the pace of the game? And that's why you got to sit on Lost Chapter, then decide, do I want to go for Crown or go for Leandri's or something like that? Yep. But I feel like it's in a good spot now. It feels really good to me personally.
Yeah, the numbers that Phroxzon mentioned there about, I
like that.
The 27, 29.
It's about 20 to 25-ish minutes, I would say.
It's 25 minutes.
Yeah. So it's down to a science, I would say. We are very specific. We've kind of like honed in on like what we feel is the right amount, because let's say, for example, the value was 28% instead of 23%, right? What would we observe in that case? We would observe, okay, well, actually, it becomes dominant to only run early game strategies. You would just go Airy Scorch every game, and you
just want to snowball out of control early.
You go Airy Scorch with Biscuit Corrupting or whatever, and you would just like beat them into submission and take all their towers and whatever. Whereas when the value is at 23, it might be like, okay, well, actually, you can play more scaling setups. You can play like Phase Rush with Gathering Storm, or if you're Victor, you can play First Strike with whatever. But if we made it down, up to like 30% of games are like functionally over at 15 minutes. Now suddenly Victor's like, okay, well now I'm forced to take Airy Scorch, because if I don't play for fast pacing and tempo, then the game's going to get out of control before I can scale, right? So it has massive implications on like champion viability and things like that.
But wouldn't there be a massive discrepancy between the West and the East in terms of game pace? Like, because Korea, even in the lower elo brackets, it's a significantly faster game pace.
Yeah,
is that true?
Is
that actually true though? Is that true?
Yeah, so I think it's true, but only because of like factors external to the game, which is like people just go AFK more and stuff like that.
That's like the whole PC ban culture or something.
Yeah, like it's just not even related to game balance at that point. It's like it's related to like player mentality, or like having to pay to play. Like it's just a completely different like equation.
What are the numbers? Do you know the numbers though? Like what like as a percentage, how much faster it actually is in Korea comparatively to like NA?
I have the numbers, but I would have to check. I don't know them off the top of my head. But
you can see it in Pro Play. In Pro Play, it's like publicly available.
Oh, in Pro Play.
Yeah, there's something around the durability patch where China like stayed the same, or like I think China maybe even got far or stayed the same. Korea increased by 4 minutes, and the West increased by 5, something like that.
Right.
Yeah.
I actually don't know. Don't quote me on the numbers.
So the Western Korea are typically the slowest regions, presumably because they're the least precise, right? And East Europe and Korea, Europe and China are the fastest regions. So like of the major regions. And what I mean by like not as precise, it's like when you talk about, the champion mastery and stuff, and it's like, okay, well, can I get a kill in this situation, right? Like China's willing to play on the knife's edge and be like, okay, well, I'm going to go for this 70-30, whereas NA or Korea might be like, okay, well, I'll just let this 70-30 go kind of deal. And
people put that on ping. Do you really think that has anything to do with ping, or do you think there's more of a mentality thing? The cultural.
Well, I mean, ping definitely played a factor, right? Because when on the MSI thing with the ping, with the high ping, people weren't playing Lee Sin, right? And as soon as they fixed the ping, people were playing Lee Sin again. So it's like you just can't play Lee Sin on high ping, like relative. But I think it only matters at the highest level. It's
right.
in my default solo queue games, like it's completely irrelevant. Like when someone has like 60 ping or like 160 ping, like I can play an OS and it's like, like I play an OS, I could play an OS in gold and it's like it doesn't matter if I have 200 ping, like I'm just right? Like actually it's irrelevant. But at the tip top level, the ping matters a lot.
1%ers.
Yeah.
You wrap this up?
Yeah. You have any other questions?
Yeah. Did you have any questions, Matt, or anything that you wanted to touch on while we're here?
I mean, I'm kind of a big fan of your guys' mentality and like the preaching the positivity and all of that stuff and the champion mastery. It's like it's really cool. I didn't really have too many questions, honestly.
Great.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well,
if you need that advice from Kurt in terms of to work on your mental stack, Phroxzon, you
know where to go.
I need a bit of help.
I can definitely help you out.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Well, we definitely got into the details in this podcast. Yeah. So that was the details. Yeah, it was very fascinating. Very educational.
Thank you so much for being so open and this was amazing. This was a really, really amazing episode, and thank you so much. We'll have to have you on again at some point in the future.
Oh, for sure. I could talk about this stuff for hours, like hundreds. Actually, we have discussions like this at work, like for the whole
week.
I
could imagine, like you guys would just be going, like on your lunch break and stuff. It's like, oh, has it been 2 hours already?
Everyone's so excited to talk. Like we just talk about League all the time.
So. Well, the great thing is, I mean, there's much as the community, let's say again, we made a joke about your notifications. You said you laugh at it. Like it's the most passionate gaming community, and especially with these balance changes and stuff like that. Like that's, as much as people, sometimes a negative stigma. Again, like it's awesome.
It's the greatest game of all time.
Yeah,
it's the greatest game of all time. League of Legends is amazing.
Yeah, the community stigma is just like it's so wrong. It's like balanced team is silver. It's like no one's been silver on the nobody who touches balance has been even remotely close to silver in like years, right? Though I will say that it is valuable having the silver perspective, right? We try and field people on the team from all skill brackets to make sure that we understand, right? Because a lot of the criticism that we get is like, well, you just buffed Garen and now Garen just presses Q and E on me and I die instantly. It's like I'm just like, okay, well, why don't you like kite him, right? But then it's like, like we need to have empathy for that type of player. So it's like it's really valuable for people of all skill brackets to be available for feedback and stuff like that. But yeah, it's kind of funny. Anyways,
well, thanks again, and good luck in your solo queue. We'll have a chat off at some point about helping you out. And
Fox is going to be in challenge.
It's terrible.
All right. Well, thanks, Matt.
All right.
Have a good one.
All right.
Bye-bye.
We'll see you, BBC listeners, later on next episode.